Hello, everyone. Welcome to this session of What is Consciousness? I'm James P. Barbieri, Associate Program Director of the Power Center, and I'll be your host for today. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call, so any problems, feel free to just drop me a message in the chat. Before we begin, I'll just very briefly remind everyone of a couple of Zoom rules. First of all, we ask participants to turn off their microphone during the presentation to ensure good quality audio. But at the same time, we encourage everyone to turn on their cameras, as we believe seeing everyone's faces and reactions creates a nice educational environment. During the Q&A and discussion, if you want to ask a question or contribute, you can either use the raise your hand function, which should be in the reactions at the bottom of your screen. Otherwise, you can physically raise your hand, and if I spot you, I'll call you out and you can ask the question. When you do ask your question, just please be respectful of everyone. So just allow everyone to just finish what they're saying, also because otherwise we can't really hear each other. And yes, finally, all sessions are recorded for archival purposes and for you all. So the recording will be available in about 3 days, so on Monday. And if you haven't received the recording, please let us know and we'll make sure you get it. And now, to begin this event, let me introduce our speaker for today, Gary Lachman. It is an honor to have Gary with us today, author of several books, including Lost Knowledge of the Imagination and Beyond the Robot, the life and work of Colin Wilson. Gary also lectures around the world, and his books have been translated in a dozen languages and is currently the adjunct professor of the Transformative Studies at the California Institute of Integral Studies. In a former life, Gary was a rock star, founding member of the pop group Blondie, and in 2006 inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So yes, today Gary will talk about Beyond the Robot, consciousness, and existentialism. And with that, I'll pass it straight over to you. A very warm welcome to you, Gary.
All right, well, lovely. Thank you so much, James. And let me see if I can get my screen going here. And let's say from the beginning. Come on, there you go. Right, okay. Everybody can see that? Yes, well, thank you. Yes, I'm going to talk about the writer Colin Wilson, and Beyond the Robot is a phrase that he uses in his writing. I've used it for title of a book I wrote about Wilson. We'll get to that in the next slide. And it's fundamentally, what would that mean, beyond the robot? Well, it's facing a fundamental kind of question that Wilson looked at and explored in a remarkable number of ways over a very, very long career, more than 50 years, during which he wrote close to 200 books, certainly more than 100. I don't know how many articles and so on, over a wide range of things: philosophy, psychology, literary criticism, history, criminology. He also wrote quite a few novels. Sadly, I won't be able to talk about too many of them. I think I'll only be able to touch on one of them. Again, in a wide range of things, and in many ways in advance of a lot of what literary critics like to say strategies and tactics of the postmodern period, such as using a genre for particular kind of purposes. To wit, he has written espionage novels, science fiction novels, crime novels, also what we would call erotica. Not quite pornography, but hovering on the edge, with an existential flair. You might even call its work of sexistentialism, to coin a phrase, and I'll try to get on to some of that later on. And for people who don't know, Wilson was born in 1931. He died 2013, a few years ago. This month he would have been 90, where he's still alive. I met him the first time paths also actually crossed was 40 years ago here in London. When I was on holiday, I was a mad reader of his, and I saw that he was giving a talk at a place called the Village Bookshop on Regent Street. It doesn't exist anymore. And I extended my stay. And it was actually in the last legs of my career as a musician. I was not a rock star. I was a lesser luminary. I mean, an asteroid or a meteorite or something along those lines. I touched the hem of stardom, you could say. I got close enough and backed away. But and I then later met him officially in 1983. And that's how I begin my book about him, Beyond the Robot, Life and Work of Colin Wilson, the publishers put everything they could into selling it. That is a very wonderfully generous blurb by Philip Pullman. Either it was too small for people to read, or I don't know, not to blame Philip Pullman, I'm just saying they took up a lot of cover space and it didn't necessarily help the sales that much. But within that, he says it's an intellectual biography of the only optimistic existentialist. And you could say that's what Wilson was. He was the only optimistic existentialist. He's the only homegrown British existentialist. What's existentialism? I think it's something people even know what that is anymore. I realize I'm talking about, a philosophical movement that had its heyday post World War II into the late 50s, when it was taken over by structuralism and then Foucault and Derrida and that crew. And I don't even know what's happening today at all. I have no idea who's deconstructing who these days. But Wilson was in that period in the 1950s. And I say in the book how 1983, during what I call a mini search for the miraculous, I was on with a friend that had us in places like Glastonbury and Avebury, but also Chartres and Notre Dame. And we also went to Fontainebleau and found the Prairie, where Gurdjieff had his Institute for the Harmonious Development of Man. During this sort of mini search for the miraculous I was on in 1983, I made a separate pilgrimage down to the tip of Cornwall in the far west of England, where Wilson had lived since the late 50s. And that's when I spent an evening with him, and through a wine-soaked evening, he explained the essence of his phenomenological approach to consciousness based on the work of Edmund Husserl and others. And I had grasped it that night, but sadly in the morning it had dissipated, and I've spent the last, 40-something years trying to get back to that same insight I had that wonderful evening. At the same time as my book came out, my publisher, Tarcher Penguin, they decided to issue a new edition of Wilson's first book, The Outsider, to which they asked me to add a foreword, and I was very happy to do that. And Wilson had already contributed a foreword to an early book of mine, The Secret History of Consciousness, which in itself would have fit into this series. And in my answer to the question, what is consciousness, is what isn't. Because I can't think of anything that we could possibly think of without it being tainted with consciousness already. So that may be a cheap answer to that question. We're not going to be talking about a what is kind of question these days, or this evening. And in a way, something that's come to me is that I write about consciousness, I give talks about it, but there seems to be a kind of dominance of the three S's, and one of the syllabants has a P before it. But you have the scientific sort of approach to consciousness, you have the spiritual, and then you have the psychedelic. And Wilson doesn't fit into any of those kind of categories. He's scientific in the sense that you could say a lot of his work is based on science. He's certainly not anti-science. He's anti-reductionist science. He's anti-determinist science. There's most of the people interested in the kind of consciousness study that I would suspect people coming to this series are about. But he's not spiritual in that way, although it isn't the kind of spiritual he is. It goes back to the very roots of people like Dostoevsky and Nietzsche and Blake and Tolstoy, and it isn't the kind of feel-good, mind, body, spirit, health and well-being sort of spirituality that has become almost a kind of mainstream kind of accommodation of these kinds of things. Because the people he's talking about in his first book, The Outsider, are people that are absolutely driven. They're passionate to in a painful, dangerous way to themselves because they have a deep hunger for some kind of meaning and purpose that the modern world can't provide. And at that time, there weren't all the ashrams, or there weren't all the meditation centers, there weren't all the kinds of things that we associate with kind of alternative spirituality these days. But Wilson, it's an existential question. It's a question of being. It's a question of meaning. It's that fundamental. Why do we exist? What are we doing here? And what should we do now that we find ourselves here? Which is sort of the kind of big ones. As far as I know, nobody's nailed those quite yet. There's a lot of things on offer, and we can pick and choose, but it doesn't seem to be a one-size-fits-all thing yet. And so Colin very kindly contributed a foreword to my book, Secret History of Consciousness here, which is kind of like an alternative history to the scientific histories, people like Daniel Dennett and Nicholas Humphreys and John Searle and all those who want to reduce consciousness to something that they can understand in terms of physical material sort of theories. And in that book, I talk about a variety of different people, ranging from Bergson and William James and Ouspensky and Steiner to Jean Gebser and people of that sort. So that I was very, pleased for that to have happened. But when Colin died in 2013, in 2014, it was December, the end of the year, and I think sometime in 2014, I think it's in October, there was sort of a memorial service for him at St. James Piccadilly, which you might know is a place where many people have spoken. Rupert Sheldrake, Matthew Fox. It's a center for alternative speakers and all that. And among the other people there who were giving a tribute to Colin, I was invited to go up and have a few words. So I had 5 minutes, and what I wanted to do was to somehow crystallize or focus into a fundamental kind of idea what his wide range body of work is. Because one of the arguments that people bring up against him with criticism is that he just wrote too much. Robert Ardrey, who he's not read these days, but in the 60s he was famous for the territorial imperative and things of that sort, he told him that you write too many books, brother. Meaning, like, he was sort of like, I asked him once whether he thought he was going to outright H.G. Wells. And if you know H.G. Wells, we all know him of the science fiction writer, but throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s up until his death, he was writing all these social tracts and books about, what should we do with our lives and trying to solve all the problems of modern civilization, modern society. Actually, many of the things he came up with were well in advance of the things that we're worried about today. But he wrote and wrote and wrote, and he wrote an enormous amount, too much, because people started to stop taking him seriously. And Colin was sort of like that as well. They were both what Isaiah Berlin called hedgehogs rather than foxes. The foxes know lots of different things. Shakespeare's a fox. Goethe's a fox. They know lots of things. But the hedgehog knows one big thing. And the one big thing Colin knew was this notion that there's something wrong with human consciousness. And this is tied to what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. And this is what I tried to get across in the 5 minutes I had at St. James. What's the paradoxical nature of freedom? Well, when freedom is threatened, when some way we feel, we know that our freedom could be taken away from us, we know damn well what it is. All ambiguity about it goes out the window. We don't worry about abstract notions of what's the essence of freedom and body, but it's like we know what it is. It's something that's deeply, deeply, deeply important and essential and fundamental to having a meaningful life that's threatened, being taken away from us. What that means is that our inner grasp on our values tightens, focuses in the face of a threat, or even in the face of an inconvenience. Death is the biggest inconvenience we can face. Anything, is a holiday under that. But in a way, we could say it's an inconvenience, whatever, to the 10th kind of power. And so, if we're in a prison cell, we know damn well, and I didn't mean for that to rhyme, what freedom means. And but what happens is when the threat diminishes, when the inconvenience is resolved, when the crisis is over, involuntarily, we loosen our grip on our values. We loosen our grip on those things that are meaningful to us, because that's what the focus of death brings to us. It shows us what's really important. Colin was very, very fond of a quote from Samuel Johnson, who said that the idea that you will be hung in a fortnight focuses the mind wonderfully. So the threat of death, and as we know, this is what the existentialists were all about, dread. Heidegger said the only thing that could waken us out of our forgetfulness of being is the contemplation of our own, death and all that, something Gurdjieff said as well. But Wilson basically says, yes, but what happens? We know we don't want to die. We know we don't want to lose our freedom. We know these things are important to us, but what takes place within us that once the threat is gone, we loosen our grip on these things and they dissipate. So this was a question, fundamental question that runs through all of his body of work, what he calls the paradoxical nature of freedom. And he remained an existentialist, even though many people know of him through the work he did in the 70s and 80s and 90s and later having to do with the occult and the paranormal, and later on Lost Civilizations, the kind of Graham Hancock kind of area. But I think the most important work he did was this and I'm a lover of all his books. I mean, my book covers all of his long career and all the many books. So if you don't want to read all his books, it's a one-stop shop for his. But this is the fundamental theme that runs through them. And his first book, The Outsider, starts this kind of ball rolling. And what is it about? It's an inquiry into the nature of the sickness of mankind in the mid-20th century. So it's almost 100 years ago, not quite. We're into 1920s. This came out in 1956. So, but he's writing about figures in the 20s and all that. He's writing about Hemingway. He's writing about even like people like Fitzgerald, not in that book, but in the later one. But it's fundamentally about these figures in literature and, I mean, actual real life, and then figures that writers have written about that somehow find themselves outside of society. And it's not just because they're social misfits. It's not because they're I don't know, people that don't fit in because of some peculiarity society doesn't allow them to fit in. It's because they have a fundamental vision of things that we could say penetrates what they've seen or the illusions that most of us engage in order to lubricate life, in order for it to go on and on. And they see at a level, we'll see when I get onto the slide, they see too deep and they see too much. But they're also driven, as I say, this kind of hunger for a kind of meaning and purpose that the modern world can't provide. In the sense that the modern world is aimed towards comfort and security. Not freedom, I mean freedom in a sense of you're at liberty to do this and that and so on, but not the kind of freedom that he's talking about. He's talking about this kind of inner freedom. He's talking about the kind of freedom that the saints pursued, or the existentials that we'll get onto, talked about in their books and all that. And there's many, I mean, and Colin himself was one of these figures. I mean, what happened, it was an overnight success. We'll get to that in the next slide. He had spent a good 10 years from when he left high school, and he himself had a horrible, it was good upbringing. His parents, working class family and all that. He was born in 1931, so he grew up during the war. But by the late 40s, early 50s, he was tramping. He had hit, on the road and all that. He was, taking, the high road and tramping across England and into France. And he would take whatever jobs were necessary in order to, get whatever money he needed. And a variety of different menial tasks, digging ditches, working on farms, picking, fruit, whatever he had to do. And there's a famous story of him, and this is a posed picture, but after his success, because The Outsider was this overnight success where he was famous throughout the land. But for a time, he famously slept on Hampstead Heath in a sleeping bag rather than pay rent, so that he didn't have to work as much, so that he can spend his days working in the reading room of the old reading room of the British Museum that doesn't exist anymore. The British Library is what it's become, and British Library is a fantastic source, but it doesn't have the same charm as the old reading room because people like Bernard Shaw and William Morris and Karl Marx and others have sat there and done the same thing you were doing. But in any case, he famously, did that. And what happened with The Outsider is that it was a surprise success. And these are all sort of photos at the time. And this is a photo of him. I guess you can see his wife, or it would be wife, Joy, in the background, living in a kind of squat in an area over in Notting Hill in London in the late 50s. And people like Alexander Truckee and a variety of other poets and beatniks and all that were in that kind of scene. It was the duffel-coated British equivalent of what was happening in the States in the Beat generation, but not quite as wild, a bit more buttoned down. But as I say, it was an overnight success. And he was totally surprised by it, but Angst became the surprise hit of the season. And he woke up one morning and The Outsider had been published, and like Lord Byron, he was famous throughout the land. I mean, the story of how the book itself got published was that he was writing his early novel, Ritual in the Dark, which we'll get onto in a moment, but he had sent that off to Angus Wilson, who was a novelist, but also worked at the British the reading room at the British Library, and he said he would send it to his publisher. So in the meantime, Wilson thought that he would do a kind of critical work, because he had worked out many of the themes of The Outsider in the novel, but he thought he would do critical work. And he started, jotting down names of people that would wind up in the book. And it's people like Nietzsche and Sartre and Camus and Hemingway and Rilke and Blake and Dostoevsky and all these figures. Again, I don't know today. I think these are part of the canon that, nobody likes anymore. So totally surprised whenever I talk about these people to, younger generations. I'm doing a class actually now for the CIS, and it's like I don't know what to say to them, because they don't know who these people are. But in any case, these are all the people that are crammed into this book, and he's trying to understand how they all fit together. And he wrote a few chapters of it, and he sent it off to a publisher, Victor Gollins. And miraculously, which never, ever, ever, ever happens, Gollins wrote back and said, yes, I want to publish this. And then the miracle continued. When the book actually came out, it was an overnight success. It was, you don't think a book on existential despair and manic, states of mind and states of suicide and things of that sort are going to be a hit summer reading, but it was. And the fundamental theme in the book was he was obsessed with the question of why so many of the geniuses of the 19th century either went insane or committed suicide, or something terrible happened to them. Nietzsche, we know, went insane. Strindberg passed through an insane period. Van Gogh will get on to, committed suicide, so on and so on. And why did that happen? Did it have to happen? Because what he saw in them was they seemed to be posed between these fundamental polarities. What you can call ultimate yes, and on that side we have William Blake, his Glad Day, and on the other side we have the Sleep of Reason, breeds monsters. And in between we have the outsider figure kind of posed evenly between them, peering into the river and wondering whether he should just jump in or not. And it seemed to Wilson that most of modern culture is on the no side. We'll get onto that later. But he himself had moments when he had this ultimate yes, and he had found it in people like Blake and in Nietzsche, but it also in, as we say, less existentially shaken or threatened poets like Rabelais, who have a kind of earthy, just love, or Walt Whitman, or someone like that, an earthy love of just existence. And because Wilson himself, he's highly intellectual and all that. He's very down to earth, and very, very sensuous. His sex was something very important to him. It was the thing for not so much drugs, as many got into it in the 60s. And so this was the question: what happened? And so some of them have the Blake actually, energy is eternal delight. Everything that lives is holy. Nietzsche is the great yaysayer in Zarathustra. And even William James is talking about in his own accounts of his mystical experiences, of how he himself went through this early in his career. He has what he calls a vastation experience, in which he has a sudden intense identification with a patient that he saw in an asylum he was working in at the time. He was just crouched up and completely withdrawn into himself, and his skin had turned green and all this kind of thing. And James suddenly felt, there but for the grace of God, if the same hour should strike for me as it struck for him, what's to stop me from being? So it's that existential threat where you find all the kind of illusions, Gurdjieff would call them buffers, that we, unconsciously or consciously, but Sartre would say, bad faith, mauvais foi, we choose to deceive ourselves, that make life comfortable for ourselves. In these moments of ultimate low, they disappear, and we see things, pretty grim, the terror of the situation. So James himself, faced this, and he came out of it, and he was one of the ones who, was able to go from ultimate no to ultimate yes. Through an affirmation of free will. But this is the kind of thing that the book was really about. And as I said before, the outsider is trouble because he sees too deep and too much, and what he sees is chaos. He sees through the self-deception that many of us employ in order to get through life and all that. And there's many figures. I can't go through all of the sort of outsider figures. I could do a talk just on that. But key to the whole theme are these three kind of fundamental types here. And we have T.E. Lawrence, Van Gogh, and Nijinsky. And we can say Lawrence is the intellectual outsider, and Van Gogh is the emotional outsider, and Nijinsky is the physical outsider. And fundamentally, what that's about is the same thing that you find in Plato, and you also find later in Gurdjieff, and you find in Jung, or you can find in Steiner. It's a sort of tripartite. Some of them turn it into, a four-part kind of breakdown of fundamental types, a kind of typology. And so there's an intellectual outsider, and he develops his intellect. And it's the intellect that pierces through all the illusions, the self-deceptions that he thinks others are in. And you might not think of Lawrence as an intellectual. You might think, well, wouldn't he be a physical type? It's Lawrence of Arabia, with Peter O'Toole, if you remember this fantastic film. He's like running through the desert and all that. But Lawrence was someone who could not stop thinking. He fundamentally could not stop thinking. And I even think F. David Peake quotes the same quote from the 7 Pillars of Wisdom that Wilson quotes in this book, saying that there are 1 or 2 moments in this fantastic book, The 7 Pillars of Wisdom, if you ever get a chance to read it, where Lawrence does actually perceive the world, does actually wake up one morning very early before the mind was awake, before the intellect was awake. And he perceived the senses just direct. But this was a rare experience with him. Most of the time, he perceived the world as this dehydrated kind of set of symbols that he was always thinking about, figuring out. And he envied how the simple soldier could, be walking around with his girl, or someone could pat an animal or something like that. So he had developed his intellect, but he was out of touch with his body and out of touch with his emotions. And subsequent biographical study have come to learn that actually, Lawrence was something of a masochist and was very much into being beaten and all this kind of stuff. So that's adds something else to this kind of mix of his relationship to his body. So we have Van Gogh in the middle, not a great intellect. I don't know if he went to the gym often, but he built up his emotions, and you could see he developed. And again, this isn't like, oh, I'm going to do this. It's not like Power Rangers. I'm going to develop this power and develop that power. It's just something happens instinctively in these people because they're types. But Van Gogh, you can see from his paintings, you have this the Starry Night, or you have the cypresses, you have the sunflower. It's something exploding with meaning and vitality and power and all that. And then you also have the crows. You also have the darkness, and he's going back and forth. He's swinging all the time between ultimate yes and ultimate no. Ultimately, it was no. He shoots himself, and he leaves a note saying misery will never end. And over here we have Václav Nijinsky, the god of the dance, who was said to be able to hover, to defy gravity. I mean, I tried to do it back in the 70s when I was pogoing. I think I managed it once or twice. But he was known to have be able to, he was fantastic. And he said, God is fire in the head. When he danced, he was unstoppable. But if you ever read the diary of Václav Nijinsky, it's one of the most heart-wrenching works of kind of spiritual confession, where he's a child. Intellectually, he's a child. Emotionally, he's all over the place. He's like Van Gogh. But unlike the other two, he had this powerful command over his body. So in the long run, the idea is to bring them all together in some way, to fuse this tripartite in some way. So the outsider fundamentally has to develop all sides of himself. And this is kind of a fundamental theme. And we'll find this, as I said, you find it in Jung, you find it in Steiner, you find it in others. Now, I just want to say a little bit more of the outsider right now. One of the things that the book doesn't get credit for, and I think it should, is like Wilson was one of the early ones to talk about Hermann Hesse in English. Hesse was very much out of fashion when the book came out. He wasn't even in fashion in Germany anymore, even though he's still alive. And Hesse wrote one of the first extended discussions of Hesse's novels. And again, I'm from a generation, I was in high school in the 70s, and all the Hesse novels were Bibles to me. I don't know again if people read them anymore, but from my generation, he was powerful influence. And also he talked about this paradoxical nature of freedom. His novel, the Steppenwolf, is the kind of archetypal expression of that. So who's the Steppenwolf? Steppenwolf is a middle-aged intellectual who has a private income. He has nice rooms. He has all the books he wants. He has music. He can dine when he wants to. He drinks wine. He smokes like cigars. And he spends his day wondering whether he'll commit suicide that night or not. Because he's so sick of these insufferable, lukewarm days. But he doesn't understand what's wrong. I got everything I want. Why can't I appreciate it? And what happens in the novel, if you know, Harry Haller, who's H.H., Hesse himself, all of Hesse's novels, it's a long spiritual autobiography. He goes out for a walk, deciding whether I'm going to go home and slit my throat or not. And he stops at the tavern, has a glass of wine, and suddenly it changes. He has the glass of wine. It's like, my life doesn't turn on trifles, it turns on Mozart and the stars. And suddenly he has this vision, this affirmation, this yay saying, and the thought of suicide is the last thing in his mind. And that's the crux of the novel. And then the best thing Hesse ever wrote is the treatise on the Steppenwolf in the middle of it, which is it's a philosophical critical study. It's a psychological study. It's just there. It has the Haller finds it at the Magic Theater, the fellow who invites him to the Magic Theater sells him this pamphlet. But that's what it's all about. And Hesse knows it instinctively, but he can't quite grab it intellectually. At least this is what Wilson says. Gurdjieff, I said, Wilson was one of the first people to write about Gurdjieff, not part of the Gurdjieff community, as it were, the group. Gurdjieff died in 1940. Prior to that, there was a ban, verboten. You couldn't publish anything. That's why Ouspensky's In Search of Miraculous came out 49, and Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales came out after that. And then you have accounts by people like Kenneth Walker and others. But Wilson, 1956, he's writing about Gurdjieff. He wasn't in any of the groups. He met Walker, and he met Bennett later on in the early 70s. But he says in the end of The Outsider that Gurdjieff's system seems to be to offer a possible answer to the outsider's question. Fundamentally, can you induce ultimate yes? If ultimate yes is the truth, what keeps us from seeing it? And why do we drift into ultimate no? Why does the Steppenwolf want to blow his brains out when he has everything he wants? And if he was threatened, if somebody came to him and tied him up, was about to slit his throat, he would love, yes, give me my 2 rooms and my loneliness and my books and all that. That's the thing, the threat would wake him up. This is what Colin found. Okay, so he takes this theme. Where are we? So I don't want to spend too much. Okay, I still got time. Okay, he takes this theme and he runs with it. The Outsider is a fantastic success, but Colin is branded one of these angry young men. But he really wasn't. He wasn't that. They were all people that were sort of whining about the welfare state and stuff like that. So we have John Osborne and John Brain, and it's the kitchen sink school, Saturday night, Sunday morning, Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. If you know those early 60s, black and white films, they're fantastic films, but it's very gritty, real life. That's why it's called the kitchen sink kind of thing. And but he wasn't interested in the social issue. I mean, again, he came from a working class family. His father worked in the boot and leather factory. And Wilson himself had worked, in dismal jobs for little money. And many of the people who are accusing him of being right wing and all that because he wasn't interested in socialism, they were parlor room pinks. They were drawing room. They came from rich backgrounds, and they were interested in socialism and progressive ideas and things of that sort. And Wilson couldn't be bothered with that stuff because he was interested in these fundamental ideas. But most of them couldn't understand that. But in any case, he got tarred with that brush, and there was a fundamental turn against the angry young man. I say in the book, you have to remember at the time, he was in the newspapers. I mean, all these people in the newspapers, they was kind of like the punks were in the 70s here. And this was the same time when people like Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe, and James Dean were becoming famous. So for a time, Wilson was in the newspapers, along with pictures of those people. And there's an account where he even meets Marilyn Monroe with Laurence Olivier at a party in the early 60s. But his second book comes out, extending the ideas, The Outsider's Search, into the possibility of a religious answer. Wilson himself considered going to a monastery, and he considered converting Catholicism, but he couldn't swallow Catholic dogma, and he couldn't give up sex. Sex is the thing that's fundamental for him. He said it's not drugs. He tried mescaline once, and he wrote an interesting piece that should never turns up in any anthologies in drug literature because it's critical of the drug experience. Like Arthur Koestler's experiences never turn up in anthologies of drug literature because they're critical of drug experience. I'm not saying, yeah, this is the future of consciousness evolution. It isn't. The psychedelic people talk about in that way, but no, Wilson didn't particularly care for his mescaline experience, and he hated hashish. He tried it, but he liked wine. He drank a lot of wine, and he liked sex. So that's why he couldn't join the monastery. But he looks at people like Jacob Berman, William Lawn, and Swedenborg, and George Fox, and Blaise Pascal, and others who pursued a kind of religious answer. And what attracted him to the possibility of religious answer is that it offered a kind of discipline. This is also why he was saying he was a fascist and authoritarian. Because he's saying our problem isn't society. It's not the establishment. It's our own self-pity. It's our own weakness. It's our own stupidity. It's our own letting go of the values that are important to us in this kind of involuntary, seemingly unstoppable drift into kind of taking it for granted, whatever you want to call that. And he's saying what we need to do is develop some kind of discipline that stops that. And that's what happens to the monks and blah, blah, blah. And funnily enough, also, he says early on, what helped him was when he read the Bhagavad Gita. And the whole idea of making the mind straight, like the Fletcher's flail and all that. So that's fundamentally what he was after, this kind of something that would make that happen. And early on, he's practicing that. But he finds he becomes fascinated with the Jack the Ripper kind of story. And in fact, again, this is one of the tributaries he starts. He coined the term Ripperology. And he's started a whole kind of study of people, speculating on who Jack the Ripper was. Why is Jack the Ripper important? Because he's the first real sex crime. And Wilson studied the history of crime. And I can't go into detail, but what he does is he takes Maslow's notion of the hierarchy of needs. If you know that hierarchy of needs, the first human needs, food, drink, and when you get that, a place to live, shelter. After that, sex or some kind of relationship, love relationship. After that, self-esteem, and then if we're lucky, you get into the self-actualization, which is creative. The first four are deficiency needs. We lack them. We satisfy those needs. The other is a need to sort of give, is a need to be creative, to do something with your powers and all that. That's later on. He's not saying this now, but that's sort of not too far down. But he does somehow see there's something very strange about these murders, and that in this novel he takes that tripartite kind of typology with Lawrence and Van Gogh and Nijinsky, and he puts it into the novel. And the novel can best be described as the brothers Karamazov meet Jack the Ripper in post-war London. Because three characters, is George Sorm, who's intellectual, who's Wilson's alter ego. He turns up in two follow-up novels. There's Oliver Glasp, who's the Van Gogh painter, and there's Austin Nunn. I'm giving the story away. I'm sorry, it's a spoiler. Who's turns out to be the sex killer in the end. And the intellectual, he has relationships with the other two, and he gets into this strange kind of relationship. He doesn't know the guy's a sex killer. He starts to suspect he is. He gets into a strange relationship with him because in a way, he's attracted to this kind of philosophy he exposes of kind of this kind of elite superiority to the people around him and all that kind of thing. And he himself feels as an intellectual. He has that, he sees too deep and too much. I mean, the novel starts when he's on a tube escalator and he sees all these advertisements for lingerie and stuff. I mean, we see this stuff all the time, but again, he's seeing this in like 52. And it's like, it creates this kind of reaction to him because it's basically dangling this kind of, desirable thing in front of, the faces of most men who aren't going to be able to satisfy that desire. And he says, there's something wrong with all that, this kind of thing. And he has this total, revulsion at modern society, which Wilson himself had when he was growing up. I said Wilson himself went through long periods of depression and all this kind of thing that he only overcome when he attempted suicide once in a class, and he was in a chemistry class. And He had decided he was sick of going through these ups and downs, the ultimate yes and ultimate no. He himself would have these tremendous kind of moments of affirmation, and then the next day he said, what was that all about? It's just like, everything is just so stupid. It's just, nothing changes. I'm not going through this anymore. So he decided to drink, whatever it is, hydrochloric acid in a chemistry class. And just before he picked up the vial, he had a very vivid imagination, realization of what it would feel like to swallow this stuff. And he suddenly realized that he didn't want less life, he wanted more. And that was a fundamental turn to him too. So the outsider he's driven to suicide, not because he wants less life, he wants more. He can't take, and sadly, characters that he writes about in fiction and in real life, or real death, as it were, Encyclopedia of Murder, first of its kind, an existential study of murder, not a true crime murder. It's something that generates a vivid realization of our own lack, of grasp on our values. Because the interest of the study of murder is that it puts into highlight our own, existential position on this. Because we look at the murderer, and for him, a human life means nothing. A human life is, the means to satisfaction or something in the way. I mean, over the summer last year, I had to write an article about the Truman Capote's book In Cold Blood from Wilson's perspective. And I don't know if you know the book, if you know the film, his whole family was murdered. And in the end, the people who killed them, they got away with like $4 or something like that. Even though a dollar was worth a lot more back when it happened in the late 50s, it still wasn't enough. So, and we shudder at the idea, oh my God, how could, but we ourselves, how intensely do we appreciate the value of life? We're in the same position of these people who don't, appreciate it until it's threatened. Most of us don't realize this, these individuals, and again, this is all instinctive. It's not them thinking it out. Wilson's the one who's thinking it out after studying all of them. He puts it all together like a scientist. But they're faced with this kind of, they face us with the question of how intensely do we actually appreciate life? And so there's a gradient, between the criminal and the average person. They're not like some, fundamentally different kind of individual. They only posit their own convenience more forthrightly and more directly than we do ourselves. So I'm just going to go quickly through. So Wilson hunkered down. He was completely, ignored by the press. He went from being a boy genius, and people like, the Philip Toynbee and J.B. Priestley and other very famous names at the time singing his praises in the newspapers, to being completely, ignored. But he hunkered down and he wrote a series of books that developed this notion of this new existentialism. And they each dealt with a different sort of thing. And one was about age of defeat. In America, its title was Stature of Man, because the American publisher wanted a more upbeat title. It's about the loss of the hero in modern fiction. It's about and what he calls the fallacy of insignificance. That to be taken seriously as a writer in the 20th century, you have to more or less accept a vision of defeat. And we can name any number, Kafka, Beckett, any number of, Beckett, Wilson considers one of the most, he met him several times, Samuel Beckett, who wrote Waiting for Godot and all that, but he considers one of the most poisonous kind of influences in modern culture, because he fundamentally spent a good time, spent years just writing, saying life is absolutely purposeless, and saying that in more and more obscure kind of ways. And, we all bow our heads because he's Samuel Beckett. He's one of the, great avant-garde writers, and certainly he must see things more deeply than we do. And Wilson's going to say, or he says in these books, no, it's all based on a fundamental misunderstanding about human perception. Because one of the points he comes to in this book, to overcome what he calls the fallacy of insignificance, that we are all insignificant. There's no meaning. We should give up the whole idea of this. Give up all this 19th century notion of heroics that we're going to, go and achieve some kind of, fundamental, advance in human existence, which is what was the urge behind the Romantics, let's say, some kind of evolutionary shift, which Wilson believes was on its way. He thought the Romantics were the first sign of that. But in the 20th century, and even now, even more so, in the post-everything world, I mean, the whole idea that we have any kind of fundamental significance in the universe is just ludicrous. I mean, that's affected the sale of a book that I wrote. It's based on that idea. I wrote a book based on the opposite of the idea. We got to get rid of the fallacy of significance. Hardly sold at all. So there you go. It's affected me directly. And it was this book that Abraham Maslow read that led to him getting in touch with Wilson and forming a friendship, and Wilson later on actually writing a book about him called New Pathways in Psychology. But then onto literature and the whole notion of what is the purpose of the imagination in literature. And this is the beginning of what he started what he wanted to call a kind of school of existential criticism, which wasn't like literary criticism, certainly not like today's literary criticism, with whatever it is, post everything, not deconstructing anything. And it wasn't like the kind of new critical school at the time, which said, the writer's life had nothing to do with the work. The work was something, we just look at separate by itself. Wilson isn't considered with what the style in which it's written, let's say, William Henry James's late, convoluted style, or necessarily with the actual explicit ideas that may be expressed, if there are ideas. Not all writers have ideas. Beckett certainly didn't have any. It's how does the writer actually see the world? What would it be like to look through that person's eyes? If you could put on, I don't know, whatever, you can put on Dickens glasses and you would see the world the way Dickens sees it. Or you could put on Tolstoy's or Dostoevsky's. And, they each have their own character and all that. They each have their own kind. That's why we read them. But he wants to say, in a way, forget about what they're saying and forget about how well they say it. But what does the world look like that they're actually perceiving? Because he wants to say we have perceptions, but we also have a will to perceive. There's an unconscious will to perceive. This will get onto when he's talking about Husserl and intentionality, which is down the road a bit here. And this is the beginning of this new existentialism. He starts to read Husserl. And if you know Husserl, I'm going to get onto him, but Edmund Husserl is the founder of phenomenology. Out of which existentialism came later on through Heidegger and all that. But his fundamental notion is that perception is intentional. Consciousness is intentional. Consciousness is always consciousness of something. And if there's a consciousness of something, there must be something that is, that's conscious of that. So there's the object and there's the subject. You can't just have consciousness of nothing. It sounds, kind of simple and obvious, but so the way Wilson will use him is that this means that, well, Husserl calls it the transcendental ego, meaning now my conscious ego, I'm not aware that underneath there's some kind of intention that is basically intending the world around me, meaning that I'm reaching out and I'm interpreting, the phenomena around me into the world that I see. But at a deep level, or whatever, there's something that Husserl calls the transcendental ego, which means that it's kind of, and Wilson talks about it, it's like a javelin thrower throwing the javelin, or archer throwing the archer. And I tend to think of a hand reaching out. So rather than in the Cartesian way, consciousness reflects the world outside passively, actually it reaches out and grabs it. And there's a variety of different ways, William James talked about that too. He talks about we carve out a kind of coherent world out of the blooming, buzzing confusion. And you can see it in other, in poets earlier and all that. But Husserl develops a whole philosophical methodology of arriving at that. And of course, there's a huge school, and there's as many phenomenologies as there are phenomenologists. And I don't know how mainstream phenomenologists may take to how Wilson uses it. They may think it's too simple. But he just takes the fundamental idea, as I said, there are perceptions and there's a will to perceive, and we're not immediately in touch with that will to perceive. But in those moments when crisis threatens, we do. It kicks in. Something kicks in, and suddenly that's why everything is vivid. We're going to get onto that. But this is the thing that he starts in that. So how do they actually see the world? And what are their credentials for making these overarching statements? Because, say, Graham Greene, who becomes one of Wilson's, he has two bête noirs, three, really. There's Beckett, Graham Greene, and Sartre. And in one, he just, in a way, the most interesting one is he has a long dialogue with Sartre. I mean, not, actual dialogue, but he's one of the people that he kind of picks up and fights with all the time. It's very, very interesting to get something out of that. But fundamentally, his argument with them is that they're making these claims about the world, and they're saying, I'm telling you the truth. I'm not a romantic. I'm not playing around. I'm not making fantasy. I'm not trying to make anything better than it is. I'm telling you the truth about it. Here it is, and it's gritty, and it's dirty as it is in Sartre, and it's, in Green, it's like full of sin, original sin, and Beckett, it's all pointless and all that. And Wilson wants to say, well, basically, what's your criteria? I mean, what's the word? Authority for saying, oh, that's the truth. I mean, can a phenomenologist look through your eyes and see, this is where you're importing certain, biases, because what phenomenology is supposed to be about, study of phenomena, how they appear before we have any preconceptions about them. So a phenomenologist would say, tell me what you see. No, tell me what something is, not what you see. No, I'm sorry, the other way around. Don't tell me what something is, tell me what you see. So if you look, it's like, what is that? And you say it's a tree. No, don't tell me what it is, tell me what you see. So there's a kind of difference there, because we automatically go and we give the answer the symbol. This is the preconceived notion of what that something is. And so we have to kind of catch that. It's kind of stencil we put up. We have to kind of catch that before, and this is how it's bracketing and all that kind of stuff. But Wilson's, he's incorporating these ideas in very readable ways. I mean, he's reading people like Merleau-Ponty, he's reading Sartre, he's reading Husserl, he's reading all these others, and existential psychology, Binswanger, Maynard Boss, and all that kind of stuff. But he's able to translate all this into very, readable kinds of things. And so, and again, I can't, I have to jump ahead to get, because we're getting close to the hour here. And these are some other books where he brings all stuff together. I talked about his interest in sex. If you ever get a chance, it's not in print. There's old Granada paperbacks of it, but you ever see it on a pound shelf somewhere, pick it up. It's one of the most interesting books you'll ever read about sex. Because fundamentally, what Wilson is saying is that sexual impulse is linked to Husserl's intentionality, and they were both involved in a kind of instinctive push of the life force into more intense states of consciousness. So he's wedding a kind of Bergsonian, Shavian notion of a creative evolution to Husserl's. Well, that's what he's doing in these books. So he's bringing together people like, I'll get onto it in more more basic ways there in these books. So some of these books have come back into print. I think the Introduction to Existentialism maybe, most of them aren't. They're probably going for very high prices. But if your library might have some of them. They're all worth reading, and they all deal with what we're getting onto now in the new existentialism. So what's wrong with the old existentialism? So okay, old existentialism more or less starts with Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard basically hears about Hegel. Hegel solved everything. He's figured everything out. It's all neatly packed away in this wonderful system. And then Kierkegaard says, "But hold on, what about me? I live in Copenhagen. How can I get around Copenhagen, with your system?" And I think F. David Pete uses this in somewhere too, the notion where for Kierkegaard, Hegel's system, the absolute idea, which he's able to explain everything, is like someone in Copenhagen asking for a map, to get around. And they give him a whole huge map of Europe. And they say, well, there's Copenhagen. Yeah. It's like, well, it's certainly there, but it's no help to me. And it's like, I'm not interested in, the system that's going to, sum everything up and make perfect logical sense. I want to know what I'm supposed to do here and now. It's the famous story where he says, one sticks one's finger into the soil and smells it to know what land one is in. I stick my finger into existence. It doesn't smell of anything. Where am I? I don't know where I am. And if I'm compelled to take part in this, where's the director? I'd like to have a word with him. And, Kierkegaard turns these notions of angst and, fear and trembling and dread. He seeks, as Wilson thought for a while, a religious answer. So he goes into Christianity and it kind of puts him into a kind of side there. But his ideas are rediscovered later on by Heidegger in the 20s, and he translates the angst and dread into, Sorg and care. And he comes out of Husserl, who we're getting to next, he kind of becomes a traitor in a way. He kind of sadly undermines Husserl's work. He learned a lot from him, and then he went the other way. But he develops this fundamental ontology and the study of being. And strangely enough, he and Gurdjieff, I mentioned, I had the image of the noose earlier on, Dr. Johnson's quote about a man knowing he's going to be hung in a fortnight, his mind will, it'll concentrate his mind wonderfully. Well, Heidegger has a similar, he comes to that similar conclusion in Being in Time, like the one thing that can save us from forgetfulness of being, from this inauthentic existence, from the self-deception we live in all the time, is a confrontation with our finitude, the realization of our death. And funnily enough, that's what Gurdjieff comes to if you ever get through Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, which is as difficult a book as Being in Time, probably more. That's probably why everybody knocked back several vodkas, before they started reading it, because I'm sure it moved it along. And that's the same reason why William James experimented with nitrous oxide, not to read Beelzebub's Tales, but to understand Hegel. He said he experimented with nitrous oxide in order to help him understand Hegel, because the visions and nitrous oxide visions are of this unitive vision in Hegel's philosophy. So sometimes when I go out in my neighborhood and I see those little canisters, I wonder, there must be a lot of readers of Hegel in my neighborhood, or at least William James. But so Heidegger, then you have Sartre, who kind of imports Heidegger, and it becomes the French brand of existentialism. And the fundamental thing about these guys is that they never seem to have the ultimate yes experience. They're very good at the ultimate no. They're very good at bad faith. They're very good at analyzing and showing the falsification of life that we all go through in society, and living inauthentically. But they don't have much to offer except this kind of grim stoicism, in the face of it. I mean, Heidegger later on, he's talking about poetry and all that. So maybe he has a little bit more, as a little bit comes in later on. He never finishes Being in Time. Some of his readers didn't either. But then we come to Camus, and Camus, he has a taste of this kind of mystical experience. This is something that Colin points out. And he met Camus, and they spent an afternoon together discussing this. And he wondered, and Camus' English wasn't that great, Colin's French wasn't that great, but he was trying to say to him, at the end of The Stranger, if you know that novel, which is about this person who sleepwalks through life. And he winds up shooting, an Arab on a beach just by mistake. It's all a big mistake. But he can't be bothered to do anything to change it. It just doesn't matter. And it's only at the end of the book, at the point of execution, again, the confrontation with that, he wakes up and he realizes he was happy. He was happy all along. Can you be happy and not know you're happy? If you're happy and you know it, clap your hands. I mean, many of us don't know it. We're not clapping our hands. At the end of the novel, Camus' character, he knows he's happy. Well, why didn't he know throughout the whole book? Why did it take having to confront his, but at least he had that vision, and you don't get that in any of these guys. And it comes up in other places in Camus. Because Camus, he wasn't like Sartre, and he was actually more a man of the earth. If you know about his early life, growing up in Algeria, he loved the sun and the sand and the stone, and he had a strong kind of, maybe like an early Greek kind of sense of, just the sheer physicality of things was enough for him. And he was a sensuous person, and he was a womanizer. My God, stories about him and all that. But he had a taste of it, but he wouldn't admit to it because he said, no, that's mystical. That's appealing to something other than the everyday. And there's a story where they're talking about this, and Colin's trying to get his own ideas across. And Camus points out the window, and there's a French equivalent of a teddy boy walking by. And he says, what's good for me must be good for him. And Colin thought this, well, actually, no, I'm sorry. Some things are too difficult for the teddy boy to understand. It's just like you don't expect him to understand Einstein. And we accept Einstein, I'm saying. So what is the new existentialism? Okay, I'm going to go a little bit over an hour here, if that's okay, just to get kind of a little bit more. And it's a combination. I could fit in a couple of the figures in here, but I tried to keep it relatively short. In that series of books, towards the end of it, Colin brings together several fundamental ideas from Abraham Maslow, Husserl, I've talked about a bit, I mentioned Maslow a bit, and Alfred North Whitehead, who I haven't mentioned yet. And for Maslow, it's the notion of the peak experience. I'm assuming people know Maslow's work and all that, a great deal. So the peak experience is this kind of absolutely gratuitous moment of affirmation that comes without threat, without anything. It just bubbles up out of nowhere. So in a way, we are capable of these moments of affirmation without being faced by a threat. Okay, so that's something that Colin thought, and Colin always wondered, can you make them happen? And Maslow said, no, you can't make them happen. You don't try to make them happen. If you try to make them happen, you push them away further. Happiness comes by itself. It's a byproduct and all that. You know, okay, yeah, but what Maslow had said to him was that when he was talking to his students about peak experiences, first, presenting the idea, they started remembering experiences they themselves had had. And as they talked about it, they started to have them at the time. Oh, it was kind of like, ooh, kind of thing. So it seemed there was a way you could kind of make it happen, in the sense that you were directing attention at the thing itself. You were remembering that it was possible. You were realizing it, making it real, which is the fundamental, what should we say, task of imagination, not make believe, make real. You were using your imagination to remember other times when you had these kind of moments, and the very process of doing that induced one of those moments themselves. So Colin was pointing out, well, maybe we can do that. What's the phenomenology of the peak experience? What's happening? What's happening here? What's happening in the head? What are the structures of consciousness? You get, kind of very technical. What structures of consciousness or processes of consciousness going on? What takes place when a peak experience happens? What takes place when the threat happens and we suddenly know what our freedom is all about, when 5 minutes earlier we were, ready to blow our brains out about it? So that's one thing. Gusto already talked about intentionality. Consciousness is intentional. Perception is intentional. We're not aware of it in our surface consciousness. My surface ego is not aware. I cannot, going like that. It's not kind of like that. It's at a deeper level, which we tap into involuntarily. There are times when it happens. But it seems like the peak experience is something like that, because the world perceived through increased intentionality does seem to have a character rather like the peak experience. And Colin is saying the kinds of affirmation moments, the ultimate yes moments, are moments when intentionality is increased. The ultimate no moments are when intentionality is decreased. Sartre is wrong when Sartre says that nausea, in his novel of that name, is the fundamental reality. This is reality as it is, without any human illusions, put over it. And the hero, anti-hero, Quentin of the novel, he's terrified at a doorknob. He looks at a doorknob and he doesn't know what it is, because its reality is greater than his, because he no longer affixes meanings that we usually give to it, or it's a tree. There's the bowl of the chestnut tree. He's transfixed by their things because they're more real than he is. And Sartre wants to tell us this is real reality, folks. And all the salads, all the bastards, ignore this. They should be hung from the lampposts, and because they're whatever bourgeois, because all that stuff gets into it. But he's saying, but I and my Simone and the other people hanging out with me, we're free of these illusions. And the world is grim and nasty and dirty as it is in my books. But we just have to, grin and bear it. And we're free, but there's nothing to do with our freedom. There's no reason for us to do one thing or the other, except we should probably, be socialists or communists and get rid of the bourgeoisie, because I hate them. So all that, this is the purpose that he gives. But Wilson wants to say, well, no, Sartre's wrong, because he's forgetting the transcendental ego. He's forgetting the intentionality. Because if your intentionality is weak, if you throw the javelin like that, it's not going to go far. If you don't pull the bow back of the arrow, it's going to fall at your feet. If you reach out like that to grab things and try to sculpt something like that, you're not going to get nothing. It's that moment. And that moment, I said, the ultimate yes, the moment when he realized himself that he didn't want to commit suicide because he imagined what it was like to have the acid. He had tightened his consciousness involuntarily. That's what threat does. It involuntarily tightens our consciousness, and we intend more. That's in a nutshell. And Whitehead is in this for a lot of reasons, but fundamentally because Whitehead, in a small book, this little book of his called Symbolism, Its Meaning and Effect, he talks about two modes of perception. He calls it immediacy, presentational immediacy and causal efficacy, which is absolutely obscure. But Wilson translates that into immediacy perception and meaning perception. And immediacy perception is just the facts, ma'am. It's the pure fundamental kind of flat world of just things. But behind that, or thickening it, some kind of thickening agent, some kind of yeast kind of agent, is this meaning perception, which gives precisely that, the meaning behind it. And we sort of Whitehead talks about prehending, which I always think is a great word, because it's about, it's not just knowing something, you actually digest it. You actually, incorporate it into your own, being. I forget the actual term, event. You are an event prehending other events and things of that sort. But there are these different modes, and the kind of, the nausea mode is a mode in which it's just the simple immediacy perception. Quentin or Sartre, and we talked about drugs before, we talked about the mescaline experience. Well, nausea comes out of Sartre's bad trip on mescaline. He had a very bad trip on mescaline in the 30s, where he had it injected, and he thought, lobsters were chasing him down the Champs-Élysées, and things of that sort, and owls were hooting at him all over the place. And so what Wilson wants to say is that Sartre is completely forgot about the transcendental ego. He's completely rejected Husserl's idea of intentionality, and he does in being in nothingness, and he does in some of his early things too. He wants to say, yes, consciousness is intentional as an object, but it's sucked toward the object, like the moon, sucks the tides. The tides don't move of their own; they don't decide to go. The tides aren't intended, but they have an object. So Sartre wants to say consciousness is like that, and and Wilson's saying, no, what you're doing, you're just subtracting the notion of intentionality, and you're saying, this is the real world. Well, the world that you're saying is real, is the world to which you're subjecting the least amount of, how should we say, the interpretive faculty or activity we engage in order to intend the world with meaning. And this is similar to what Camus says when, he says in Sisyphus, where he gives the example of, back in the old days when people went to a telephone kiosk, a telephone booth to make a call. If you're on the outside, you can see somebody on the phone and they're making all gesticulations and doing those kind of stuff, and we don't hear what they're saying. And so it seems like, this is an idiot kind of phantom show. And he's saying, that's it. That's reality without all, they're from this hermeneutics of suspicion that, Paul, God, I can't remember his name right now, Paul Ricoeur talked about. They start from the fact that, yes, we have to start from being suspect of, human emotions, suspect of our ability to falsify things. And they start from that, but they stay that all the time. And what Wilson's saying is that, well, you can't say human existence or our experience is an analogy to that, because what have you done by, what actually has happened when you're looking at the person in the phone booth? You've subtracted something from it. It can't be more real because you've taken away the hearing. If you were in the phone booth with them, or if the door was open, you'd hear the conversation and it wouldn't seem absurd. So it's just, to him, it's just saying they just don't, it doesn't work. So what he fundamentally comes to is this notion of crisis, inconvenience, and what he calls the indifference threshold. And this is a fantastic picture of Harold Lloyd, an old American film comedian. And here's one of Wilson's bête noirs, Graham Greene. And the reason I have this here is one of the stories that Wilson tells all the time. It's a famous story about Graham Greene. Graham Greene, when he was the writer of Power and the Glory, again, I don't know if he's read these days or not, but when he was a teenager, he suffered incredible boredom, absolute terrible boredom. And he was so bored that his brother had a revolver, and he took the revolver and he went on to the common, where they lived. And he had one bullet, and he put a bullet in the chamber, spun the thing, and he played Russian roulette. Okay, so teenager bored to death, literally. And so he goes and he clicks the thing. Obviously, he didn't blow his brains out. But what had happened, Green writes about this in an essay called "The Revolver in the Corner Cupboard." He says, when I heard the hammer click on the empty chamber, it was as if suddenly the world had, lit up, and all these possibilities were around me. And, basically, suddenly he wasn't bored anymore, and he came back to life. And my God, the world is fantastic and full of whatever. Two seconds before that happened, he was so bored that he was willing to, take a chance on blowing his brains out. So what happened? The world didn't suddenly change. Something happened to him. And what Wilson says what happened is that when he went like that, his mind went like that. It's the threat, the inconvenience forces an involuntary tightening, an involuntary kind of, muscle, flexing. This is why he says Sartre said he never felt as free as when he was in Paris working for the resistance and he could have been arrested by the Gestapo. This is why also a lot of people who lived in London during the Blitz said it was the greatest time in their life. They never felt so alive. But okay, so this is why Wilson's outsiders followed Nietzsche's advice to live dangerously. Build your houses on Vesuvius. I mean, that's one of the best lines ever. You have to be pretty damn confident to do that. And Nietzsche was one of these guys who, he went mad, but lived dangerously. His outsiders, they instinctively knew that the soft, comfortable life, as Wilson says, it breeds spiritual decay, like soft food breeds tooth decay. And they instinctively would throw themselves into these very dangerous kind of situations. Or Dostoevsky writes about all of them. He himself, the famous story of him in the mock execution, when he and several other of his comrades at the time who had been arrested for political activity, and they were taken out. They were going to be. They told they were going to be executed. It was a prank, as it were, but they didn't know. And he tells the story of how he's facing, the execution squad, and he sort of had this, a minute to say, goodbye to his colleagues, a minute to think about something else, and then he suddenly had looked around, and the world never seemed so incredibly beautiful. And this is something he incorporates in, Raskolnikov in Crime and Punishment, when he says that, if someone was told you had the choice, if you had the choice of standing on a narrow ledge in the midst of tempest and storm and ever in darkness and eternal night, forever and ever, or extinction now, utter annihilation now, which would you choose? And Raskolnikov says, oh, you would choose the ledge, because you would know that life is infinitely desirable. And Dostoevsky used all these parables about this, about the sinner. That's another famous one who when he dies, he goes to heaven at the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, sorry, I can't let you in. You have to walk 1 billion something miles before you can do it. And he says, screw that. I'm not going to do it. And he sits there for millions and millions of years and finally decides, okay, I might as well do it. And he does it. And he finally lets him in. And he says, I would walk it 100 times more for a second of the reality I've now entered into. So the value of life is infinite. And, the characters, Wittgenstein, he threw himself into a variety of not necessarily dangerous, but these very strange, uncomfortable things. He became a school teacher in Austria. He got in trouble for slapping a student. He lived in a hut in Norway. He gave away all his money. He inherited this huge fortune and he gave it away. So they go out of their ways to make their life uncomfortable. I do it all the time myself. I should know better by now. They go out of their ways to make their lives uncomfortable because they know the comfortable life is a kind of death. Why is it? We're getting to the robot finally now. Wilson has an interesting little idea to help him understand what actually happens when the threat, recedes and we involuntarily, against our best wishes, our best hopes and promises, take everything for granted again. It's because we have an evolutionary labor-saving device called the robot that does its job too well. The robot is what has allowed you to learn how to ride a bicycle. It's what has allowed you to learn how to type. It's what has allowed you to, learn how to speak a foreign language. It's what has allowed you to do any number of sorts of physical or mental, even operations that at first require a great deal of conscious attention. They require a great deal of conscious attention, and at one point it passes over, and you've learned how to do it. What does that mean, you've learned how to do it? Well, actually, you're not doing it anymore. You've given it to your labor-saving device called the robot, and he or she is doing it. So now, because I've given these talks lots of time, I'm not thinking about what am I supposed to say, and if I would trip myself up as the centipede was tripped up when the ant once said, "How do you move all those legs?" "Oh, it's easy. Wait, how do I move all those legs?" And the centipede can't move anymore because he starts to think about doing something that he used to do involuntarily. The robot was doing it. So if I start thinking about Jesus, where are we going? Am I talking too much? They're looking like they're bored and all that, which may be true. I'm sorry. I'll trip myself up. So the robot does all this stuff, but he does his job too well. He winds up doing things that we'd rather do ourselves. So Wilson says, if you listen to some symphony or something, whatever it is, that at once, gave you this sudden thrill and of delight and all that, but fourth, fifth, whatever 10th time you listen to it, whatever it might be, it doesn't do the same thing anymore. You've got used to it. Getting used to it means that you've allowed your robot to do it for you. And we need the robot. We can't do without it, because you'd have to learn how to type every time you wanted to, use your keyboard. You'd have to learn how to ride a bike every time you want, and it just can't do that. So there's a phrase from T.S. Eliot that Wilson is fond of quoting. I think it's in the Four Quartets, where Eliot says, "Where is the life we have lost in living?" Okay. Where's the life we have lost in living? Well, we handed it over to the robot. He's not a villain. We just allowed him to take over too much. But what happens in crisis is that it's too important for the robot to do, and we have to do it ourselves. So we wake up and suddenly we're there. And as Wilson says, it's usually, on a good day, it's 50-50. On a bad day, it's sort of like, 52 robot and 48 you. And more it gets robot and less you. You move towards, forms of insanity or schizophrenia or complete automatic kind of dull life, the kind of life that led, Graham Greene to try and blow his brains out. But on good days, it's 51 you and 49 robot, or 52 you and 48 robot. And those are the days when, as William James talks about in a very, very important essay called The Energies of Men, that we somehow are tap into these other levels of energy that we have available all the time, but the pressures and crises of the day do not demand that we use them. So he too, and this is one of the things I think, if mentioned Gurdjieff a few times, if you know the Gurdjieff movements, if these very, very complicated movements that are, that kind of thing, but done, to the 10th power. And years ago, I practiced them. And I had this experience where they were incredibly difficult to do. I couldn't get them. And one time I tried, and bang, I did it. And as soon as I got them, I had a sudden influx of enormous sense of power and energy. And what that was is, I would say, in just straight psychological terms, as James is talking about it, is this phenomena of second wind that athletes have. When they reach what they really feel is the end, it's like they have nothing, there's no more petrol in the tank. That's it, they're running on fumes. And then they make one more effort, and they push over this boundary, and they suddenly have a full extra tank. So what Wilson is trying to come up with, and I'm going to go through this, the outsider's predicament, is the outsider is driven by a hunger for purpose and meaning that the modern world can't provide. He must accept himself for what he is, not a misfit, but an agent at the next stage of human evolution. Wilson very believed that. I did too. Who's an outsider? Well, I don't know. You can't join a club. You can't get a card and all that. You're not going to get a newsletter. But people are like this out there. He must reject the fallacy of insignificance. You are important, not in some personal kind of way, not in that way, but in the sense that somehow humans have a responsibility in this world. We straddle both worlds. We straddle the physical world and this inner, mental, spiritual world. And somehow we're caught in between these two things, just like we're caught between ultimate yes and ultimate no. And that just seems important to me in some way. Again, not in some, let's, blow our horn and bang our own drum kind of way. But I think we've really gone too far in this notion of like having to think humans, not only that we should be humble, but that somebody we should get rid of. We're the source of everything that's wrong in the world in so many ways, as they say. But he seeks out danger instinctively as a means of intensifying consciousness. The danger isn't what's important. It's the danger triggers this intensification of consciousness. Can we do that ourselves? Right? This is the fundamental question. This is what imagination should do. If it is true that the thought of my impending being hung will concentrate my mind wonderfully, let me imagine that I'm going to be hung. Let me see if I can imagine I'm going to be hung as intensely as I can. Will that have the same effect? And what actually is that effect? What constitutes that effect? It's my awareness of the value and significance I have, or I place in the things I already have. The things I already have. When Dostoevsky was at the end, when that mock execution was over, and anything was wonderful and beautiful and incredible. And so we too should have that kind of sense, not necessarily all the time ecstatically, drooling over it, but fundamentally, we should never be taken in and hoodwinked by the notion that it's not worth it. Or in the words of an old Peggy Lee song, is that all there is? This is the thing. And he must find a way to free himself from the robot voluntarily, not depend on external stimuli. This is one of the things that Wilson, I think most important stuff he worked on, and I'm not gonna be able to get into. He must develop a way of strengthening his intentionality. So is there a way of getting rid of the robot without putting a gun to our head? This is what he calls the challenge of no challenge. And which he spells out specifically in this book here. I can't talk about these. They're very, very important books. This is one of the only science fiction sort of horror story where the heroes defeat the bad guys through phenomenology. The mind parasites. The mind parasites are these psychic vampires that have been eating away at the human soul and consciousness certainly since the Romantic movement. They're responsible for getting rid of all the Romantics, because the Romantics suddenly became aware of how powerful human consciousness is. And the vampires don't want that, because we become too powerful and we'll become aware of them and throw them off. So they wipe them out. And the story is basically that someone becomes aware of them. Someone becomes aware of the vampires. And all the action takes place in here. There's incredible scenes where there's like battles going on in the mind itself, and it's all about pulses of intentionality and waves of existential despair, and it's incredible. But The Black Room is a book about sensory deprivation, and I'll end on this. And challenge of no challenges, Wilson says, we're absolutely fantastic when facing a challenge. When the challenge goes, we fall apart. We have all been in a kind of sensory deprivation chamber, as it were, to some extent, over the past year with lockdowns and things of that sort. I know in the initial phase of it here, when, very strictly staying to your room. And it seemed like, we have an opportunity to face this. Can we develop the kind of response to the challenge without the actual challenge, without being dependent on an external stimuli to trigger it? Can we learn how to get a hold of, as it were, those kind of, the muscles of intentionality, and find a way to activate them without having to depend on an external stimuli to do it for us? So I'll leave it there. Sorry I went over a little bit. Let me get a drink of water and I'll be right back. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gary. So yes, Gary's just gonna just take 5, get a glass of water. I don't know if Shantana, you had any words to say about this presentation?
Sure, it's a wonderful presentation, and it seems to me it hits the heart of challenges that we are confronted with, and the power of the robot in contemporary high technology culture is immense. And I think we're very much confronted with what Gary called the paradoxical nature of freedom. in that hello, Gary. And that it seems like the sense of meaning and value is slipping away in ways which are sometimes too subtle to catch, to be aware of in our contemporary world. I would love to hear Gary's comments on the present significance of the things he's so brilliantly talked about.
Thank you.
Maybe we should let all our listeners also have a little break.
Yes, absolutely. Let's say we all come back at unless Gary, we'll come back at past on half of the hour.
Thank you, James.
See you all in 3 minutes.
Okay, I'm back.
Oh, you're back.
Yeah. I just sorry. I went over more than I wanted to, or I don't really want to go over.
I told everyone to sort of take a 2-minute break. I don't know.
That's good. That's fine.
We'll have break-in, but yeah, let's just wait till half past.
All right. Oh, all right. We're almost there. It's a lot of material.
It's very, very interesting material, I have to say.
Yes, Gary, and while you were gone, James asked me for some comments, and I would love to hear your comments on. It seems to me that some of the notions you've proposed, like the paradoxical nature of freedom and the power of the robot, are in our highly technological culture and with the strong development of.
Well, I would certainly say it kind of helps, the problem.
Right. Yes. Yeah. It seems like in some ways we're at high risk of losing our sense of values and meaningfulness in a slippery way, not as a macroscopic threat, in like some moment to moment.
No, I agree. Well, I think, understandably, we all want security. And that's what's sold to us more and more, I would say, in a way. Security, I think, is sold to us more and more for your own good and some, you have to do this, you have to do that. And, there's been a lot of surveys where people were asked, well, if you were asked to give up whatever, these liberties in order to, help this, whatever it might be, COVID or terrorism or whatever it might be. Oh, sure. And their immediate response, and it's like altruistic. Yeah, I'll do that. Okay, it needs to be done. And understandable, but at the same time, it's kind of like that seems to be, we can never argue against that. It's sort of like you can't, and I'm in no way in favor of all the people that are saying, there's whatever it is, nano robots in the vaccines. If there is, they're in me. I'm spreading them already, so I don't know. But I mean, I'm not in that, but it seems there are these kind of things where we can't, and that's what the whole, again, he's not saying, what he is saying is sort of like, in a way, it's okay to have the comfort, but we have to find a way for it not to, precisely what you're saying, not to allow ourselves to slip into it so well that we lose, touch with the things that are really important. And that's something, that's why he's always trying to develop some kind of discipline in the sense of, something that will work to prevent that from happening.
Right.
And, but more and more, we give over. I mean, it's like so many things do things for you. And I don't want you to do that for me. Whatever it is, the phone, and it's all these things I would never even think about doing. You're telling me you've done this for me already. I don't even, you know what I mean? Like my phone is always doing something. I don't want it to do that. I've talked to it. I've tried. It doesn't listen, and it just does stuff. And it's like this is someone assumes like, oh, they must know already. This guy's not going to do this. It needs to be done. We're going to do it for him. And somehow we're going to keep his phone up to speed with everybody else's, even if he doesn't want it to be. So but I think that's in many ways, obviously there's generations that grow up now and they take all that for granted. That's why I wonder if any of the stuff I'm talking about means anything to anybody of a contemporary time. I mean, I'm doing a course now for the CIS, and I mean, it's I really enjoyed in doing it, but there is the kind of thing like, well, shouldn't we be talking about this? The hot topics. I don't have to point them out because they're much more relevant and important, and not the sort of thing you're talking about. And I always say, well, actually, the course is about this. So there just seems to be this kind of thing like, well, you really should be thinking about this. Yeah, sort of back in the 60s kind of way when students, they're not quite doing that, but when they would demand classes to be relevant. And I don't know, I can't think of anything more relevant than the stuff I'm talking about. So I try to get that across to them.
Well, maybe the second generation coming will.
What we hope, yeah. The skips. My sons, they couldn't care less about it. They have no idea what I'm talking about. They just. Why is everything lost and forgotten and secret that you write about, they say? It's like the lost knowledge and the secret teachers. Like, why is everything like that? Sorry, some water.
Thank you, Gary.
Yeah, thank you, Gary, and thank you for your fantastic presentation.
Oh, thank you. My pleasure.
I do have many questions for you, but I can see that our audience as well.
I'll try to keep them short answers. So.
Yeah. Well, so we have quite a few hands up. So I would say let's open it up to participants.
Yeah. Okay. Go for it.
So the first question I think will come from Ferd.
What you're talking about, Gary, reminds me of an article that Rebecca Goldstein wrote for the Atlantic. Rebecca is the wife of Steven Pinker, and the article talks about. It's called. The article was written in 2017. It's called "Making Athens Great Again," and how the question, the headline, the subhead is, how does a citizen respond when a democracy that prides itself on being exceptional betrays its highest principles? Plato despaired, but he also pointed the way to renewal. And I'm thinking about, I mean, she writes about, she compares America, in 2017 with Athens at the time of Plato. This complacency and this kind of, apathy. And when you're talking about 1950s America, that's what I was thinking about.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, Wilson's writing in the context of sort of England in the 50s. So. And
it make it what I did not realize until about 2018 was that the Make America Great Again campaign goes back to Britain in the 1950s because with the, I don't know if people remember the Conservative Party in Britain that Make Britain Great Again campaign with a bulldog on the front.
Well, they had the Festival of Britain in '51. I mean, I'm from the States. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey. I lived in New York and LA. I lived here for 25 years, but I read all this stuff. And I mean, Wilson's writing about, I mean, in the beginning, the outsider period, when he's writing about, this is 50s, you have to think of like, post-war, there's still bombed out sites. It's really, really, in a way, I mean, I read this novel, Ritual in the Dark, over and over again, because it really presents a picture of London. And it's all this kind of bleak, kind of, everything's, really small and cramped. And I wanted nothing better than to go and live in one of these bedsits, which is like a one-room place, drinking cold tea out of a thermos. And that's why I've lived here now for 25 years. But that's the scene that he was in at the time. There is this kind of complacency. It's this keeping up with the Joneses. This is what this book The Age of Defeat was about, was this notion of other directedness rather than inner directedness. So this kind of extroverted idea about, oh, we have to be aware of what everybody else is doing and keep up with them in conformity and all that kind of thing. And he was seeing how that was, yes, you had some, revolts against that with the beats and the, the angries, but more and more it seemed to be kind of the, the dominant thing. And yes, you're right, that's what he revolted against. Yeah, his own early life was very much an example of that.
Simone Weil, in the pre-World War days, also gave up her upper class lifestyle to work in the most miserable factory conditions. She was a Jewish Christian mystic.
Simone Weil, yeah, sure. Oh, there's many examples of that. I mean, I said these people that they just put themselves in these very difficult situations, and that somehow makes them feel more alive. I mean, that goes back to the the monks, ascetics, whipping themselves and so on. But the thing is that seems a rather extreme and uncomfortable way to do it. Is there a way we can achieve the same effect without doing that? And that's what he was trying to get to. But maybe we should pass on to another question.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ferd. Next question will come from Beth.
Yeah, I have a naive question, Gary, because I'm not a reader of philosophy, so I feel kind of dumb asking this. But I wish you'd say some more about intentionality. I'm curious, is that something that Wilson and you consider more or less an endogenous psychological kind of factor? Is it something external to us that we can breathe in, or where does it come from? What's
it's the notion that consciousness is always consciousness of something. So consciousness is you can't have one without the other. You can't have consciousness of nothing. Put it that way. That would be unconsciousness. So and what the philosopher Edmund Husserl is saying is that there's a unconscious or an involuntary kind of effort to actually perceive things. We're not aware of that. When I open my eyes, it just seems stuff is just there. I'm not aware, and I can, if I'm an artist, I can kind of learn how to look at something in that way. And in a way, that does lead into a kind of. But what he's talking about is on a deeper kind of level that we never are aware of, voluntarily. But it's in these moments of crisis when something confronts us, and we involuntarily, there's all these old stories about, a mother seeing her child just got, run over by a car, and she runs over and she lifts the car up, and she would never be ever be able to do that, if someone said, go do that. But strangely, she's capable of doing. That's the kind of stuff that William James writes about in this essay of his called the Energies of Men, and that's available on, there's a PDF online, so you can find it. So it's only in situations like that that trigger this involuntary sort of increase in the intentionality, let's say, that we become momentarily aware of it. So that's what he's talking about. So it's not like we have intentions. I intend to go to the store. I intend to make dinner after this talk, that kind of thing. Or but it's not something we're conscious of. So if you try to think of the notion that we have perceptions, but behind them, there's a kind of effort we are making at a level we're not aware of to actually perceive things. And what he's saying in these moments of heightened consciousness, that effort somehow increases. And when that happens, you see more in the sense of, you see more meaning of things. Suddenly, you see this happens in mystical experiences. If like Aldous Huxley's famous account when he took mescaline, and he was like looking at the folds of drapery, and they were just the most beautiful thing he ever saw. And somehow his intentionality, the drug had somehow allowed that to increase in some way. So more reality that's there all the time was coming in. So that, I don't know if that helps, but it's sort of like that. It's not something we can become immediately aware of. We can sort of we can become aware that it's happening, but we can't kind of, feel it in the way that, we normally would. It's not a thought. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Beth. We'll take the next question from Chris.
Hi, thanks very much for that. It was great. I'm Chris. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada.
Oh, well.
And I was quite interested in your talk, the bit about Whitehead as one of the new existentialists. And I thought maybe I'd clarify a couple of the concepts that you mentioned and see if how or if that changes what you were talking about there. So in Whitehead, as any event comes to be, it goes through stages, through phases. And the initial phase is prehending or perceiving. It's the primary mode of perception to him. It's perceiving all the past, and which is the prehending of the past. And anything that positively constitutes that phase or constitutes that event from the past, that's what creates causal efficacy. So anything that has causal efficacy is that which is prehended from the past, which is the whole universe from the past that we incorporate into the moment. So it's the past moving into the present. And then it goes through a stage of novel potentials, but the presentational immediacy is sort of, you can't really talk temporally, but is a later stage or a later phase that is through our senses. So then we're immediately perceiving the moment of what's happening now, or what we're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're tasting. All of our senses brings the moment that's now into immediacy. And this is a secondary perception as far as he's concerned, because it brings into the present those things that are important from that has causal efficacy from the past. And once that's all incorporated, it's then all condenses together and vectors into the future, which then has causal efficacy for the next moment. So it's that idea of bringing in the past, creating something new, being presented with the immediacy of what's around us and what is happening now, and each one of those has a certain intention and aim forward and vectors into the future. And so that's those concepts of prehending and causal efficacy, and it's the presentational immediacy that through symbolism then we make sense of all of that. We make sense of what we've prehended from the past. We make sense of what we're perceiving in the moment. And it's through that symbolism then that we make sense of it and make the choices and move into the future.
Oh, thank you for that. That's brilliant. Thank you. I mean, I had to move on, so I couldn't include all of that. Right. When I was talking. No, but I mean, he gives, I know in symbolism, its meaning, in fact, he does, I mean, it's a simple sort of example. I think he talks about William Pitt on his deathbed says, what shades we are, what shadows we pursue. And for Whitehead, this is an example of that, I would say just in a stripped down language that Wilson applies to Whitehead's, what he's saying is that, in the last stages of his life, when he's there on his deathbed, he's just seeing the flat surface of things, and the notion that there's any kind of meaning, any depth, which I would say is what you're talking about, is the past events and, everything making up the actual event and all that, so that sake of a better way of putting it, that wasn't working anymore. All he was seeing was immediately. And then the opposite of that is, I think, doesn't he say somehow the reason we're afraid in the dark is that we can't see it, but we somehow have this sense out there, vague sense, ooh, there's something kind of there. Is this kind of reaching out that you're talking? So I'm again, you're spelling it out in more detail than I can do, and I'm glad you did it. I mean, I have to go back and read Whitehead. I mean, I've read him ages ago, and I remember a time where actually I thought of studying him, and I went to Claremont University, where David Ray Griffin was, who was writing back in the late 80s and 90s. He was writing this kind of positive postmodernism sort of thing he was trying to get across at Whitehead. And I subsequently learned that he became one of the major theorists of the 9/11,
Yes.
the conspiracy, and that was yeah, I don't know. I didn't read his books about it, but I thought that was quite strange. No, but thank you very much for spelling that out. And you've told me that I have to make sure there's no real Whiteheadians or Husserlians in the audience next time I give this talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for that clarification. We'll take the next question from Mel.
Hi everyone, I'm Mel. I'm in Manila right now.
In Manila?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Too. Anyway, I as I listened to your talk, I remember that it seems similar that the Japanese literary scene really felt parallel to what you were discussing about, in the early 1900s, we'd have these novelists in Japan like Osamu Dazai, or the short story Akutagawa, the guy who wrote In the Grove, which became Rashomon.
Yes.
All these writers, they seem to have this writers club that had suicidal tendencies, and some of them successfully committed suicide. I mean, aside from that layer of, cultural layer that in Japan, it's not so uncommon. And then you'd have, let's say, more famous writers right now that are at least translated into English, like Haruki Murakami. And I listened to a talk recently about his writing style of patterning it after music rather than, it's sort of like a rebellion towards the literary styles of the of the 20th century, because he was patterning it after how he listens to music and how he listens to jazz. So I find it interesting that even in Japan, it seems that there was this parallel of development of how existentialism manifests through their literature. And even going to, let's say, concepts like the robot, I don't know if it's found in a lot of Japanese novels, because rarely do we get English versions of those novels, but they're found in a lot of anime, like the existentialist questions that you have coming from young boys that are outsiders, or young men who are outsiders and trying to figure out themselves in the world, figure out their relationship with technology. A lot of it has been discussed in anime movies or anime or manga, Ghost in the Shell or Evangelion or Akira. So it's very interesting that perhaps now the form is slightly also changing, that we might actually see all these ruminations in other more popular art forms, like
absolutely. I mean, I can't agree with you more. I think it's one of the things. Well, Wilson himself was very, very popular in Japan. I don't know how much he's in print now, but for a time many of his books were in print, and he did a lot for Japanese TV as well. And I can't agree with you more about how these existential questions, and also kind of mystical questions or spiritual questions. Jeffrey Kripal writes about this sort of stuff. There's a wonderful book of his called Mutants and Mystics, which is about how comic books basically became the organ for these kinds of things, because the highbrow, culture just turned its nose up at it. We have to be boring and dull and talk about dreary, whatever it might be, or all the social issues that everyone is absolutely hypnotized. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Absolutely hypnotized by today and can't think about anything else. And it's in the comic books. That's where it is. And you can find it, popular culture, is it's the, whatever you want to call it, the alternative tradition, the counter tradition, rejected knowledge. And I would say Wilson's, he writes about ideas, but he's a popular writer. His books are page turners. I mean, they're just the books of ideas are, and the novels are as well. Sadly, only one of them was turned into an absolutely horrible film. It's a book of his called The Space Vampires, which is a great just page turner. And it's turned to this wretched film by Tobe Hooper called Life Force. And there's only two good things in it. And if you've seen the film, you know what they are. And I'm sorry, I'll make it'll turn out to be a sexist remarks if you kind of get my drift. Excuse me. But other than that, there's nothing else good in the film. But he uses these genres, and this is the kind of thing that all these postmodern tacticians start to recognize that so-and-so is using the genre. Wilson was doing that a long time ago. He was also doing the kind of time, the sort of thing Peter Ackroyd was doing in his novels in the 80s, Hawksmoor and The Diary of Dr. D, where you have parallel time. So something's taking place in contemporary time, and then it's taking place in whatever 18th century. Wilson was doing that in his novels as well too. So, but no, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm all for it. I mean, I don't, all these highbrow stuff and the post everything today is just dreadful. And I think we need to look at these pop culture for the stuff to happen. It's all the stuff that was on the margin is now in the center, and it's the real margin. It's like the kind of stuff we're interested in. Sorry, it's a plug here, but yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mel, for that. And now we'll move over to Ronald.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I actually watched Life Force, Gary.
So you know what those two things are.
Yeah, it's a super 80s, typically 80s movie. Basically, my gateway to philosophy was through Sartre. I was an engineer for 12 years, but working in industry, I felt like a cog in industry. But when I was working, it was my sub-interest, philosophy in college. And I think the first book that I really read from page to page is Being and Nothingness.
Right. Good for you.
So, so I got tired of the corporate world. So I went into philosophy after that. So I took my graduate degree and my master's in philosophy. So I was going through Sartre, Husserl, phenomenology, and Heidegger. And basically what you said about the robots, it's basically like bad faith concept of Sartre, right? When different kinds of bad faith, we pretend that we are an object ourselves because we don't let freedom the chance to work its way through us. Sartre said man is condemned to be free. But we do that in various kinds of bad faith. And Husserl, on the other hand, it's not so much an existentialist in a depressing sense because he's a phenomenologist, but he sort of spurned the movement, the phenomenological movement that sort of went with Heidegger in one way and with existentialism in the other through Sartre. But Heidegger was really rejecting to be called to be an existentialist.
Yeah.
But the scholars put him up there. The scholars classify him as an existentialist, even though he doesn't want to be. So aside from intentionality, which what else did the sort of Collins? I never read Collins. Collins sort of developed aside from intentionality from the ideas of Sartre and Husserl specifically.
Well, I mean, he admires Sartre. His relationship to Sartre is sort of like Nietzsche's relationship, say, with Wagner or Plato with Socrates. He can't leave him alone. He's always arguing with him. He always picks him up and put him down. And what he likes about Sartre is thinking to a purpose. He's directing his mind at his experience and trying to get to it and analyzing it. And he's all for bad faith and all of that. Fundamentally, what he thinks Sartre makes a big mistake in rejecting Husserl's transcendental ego. That's the fundamental thing. He thinks Sartre wants consciousness to be passive. It's intentional, it has an object, but it is drawn to the object rather than something intending it. Where Husserl, going back to Brentano, is saying there's a something, he borrows transcendental ego from Kant, there's a something that is pushing out my intention to perceive the world, and it helps, it organizes the world, in that sense. And Sartre is saying, no. What happens is objects in the world suck our consciousness out at them, and we're at their mercy. We're free, man is condemned to be free, but there's a famous story Colin tells about where Sartre had given a lecture at the Sorbonne after the war. And you Frenchmen, you are free, all this kind of thing. And the students came to him afterwards and they said, yeah, professor, what should we do with our freedom? And he said, do whatever you like. So he had no idea what to tell them what to do with their freedom. He didn't know what to do with his freedom. That's why he drifts more and more towards communism and Marxism, and he tries to put you know, the critique of dialectical materialism. He's trying to wed, because he hates the bourgeois. And he hates them. So he wants to wed Marxism, because Marx hates the bourgeois too. They have to be swinging from the lampposts. So he wants to wed Marxism to his existentialism, and it doesn't quite work. I mean, I admire Sartre. I'm funny you say. I've read some of Being and Being in Nothingness recently. Reread it. I mean, you know, bits and pieces.
But actually,
it's a tough read, and it's invigorating. It's invigorating.
Yeah. That's the problem with Sartre. He never had direction. He defines, we must have freedom, but he never does have direction.
Well,
when people ask him, he just freedom without, it's like really ambiguous.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, everyone. This makes Wilson's point. Everybody knew what freedom was when the Germans were occupying Paris.
Yeah, exactly.
They wanted it more than the gauloise. They wanted it more than wine. They wanted it more than cigarettes. They wanted it more than cheese. They want. If you ever see the film Is Paris Burning? It's an old film in the 60s. It's a fantastic black and white gritty film. And I watched it recently. Well, not recently, a couple years back, when the Notre Dame was in flames. And I posted about it. Yes, Paris is burning. Yes, horribly, sadly so. But everybody in that movie knows what freedom is. But once the Nazis have left the building, once they've left, they've gone, they don't know what to do. And something that Wilson points out, if you ever get a chance, is Simone de Beauvoir's novel, The Mandarins, which is all about, you know, post-war Paris. They don't know what to do except drink a lot, getting in and out of bed with everybody and all this kind of stuff, just like we all do. We all don't know what to do. That's the problem. We don't know what to do with our freedom. If somebody takes it from us, you know we want it. When we have it, I got to kill time. So this is something that he's trying to work on. But no, he admires Sartre, but it's sort of like, if you ever get a chance, he has a long essay called Anti-Sartre, which started out as a book review of a biography, or I think it was an edition of Sartre in the Living Philosophers or something. I forget what it was, something like that. And he used to write, there was a old magazine back in the day called Books and Bookmen, and they would just let him write as long as he wanted. They didn't pay him anything, but they just would let him write. So the book review turned into like a 40,000, 50,000 word essay or something. And if you ever get a chance, it's you know, if you're interested. I mean, again, I have no idea how anybody in the academic world looks at Wilson's interpretation of all this. He was persona non grata. Nobody took him seriously at all. So
yeah, I just heard about him in your talk. So basically what Sartre, I just heard about Collins in your talk.
Yeah,
so basically what Collins did was he zeroed in on Sartre's ambiguity about freedom. Basically that's what he did.
Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Yeah. He said, well, what's that about? You know, and he tried to. He never met him, but he met Camus. He tried to meet Heidegger, but Heidegger was in you know, the Black Forest of his hut, and he wasn't taking any visitors. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary.
Thank you, Jono. As we're approaching the end.
Oh, sorry.
No, it's okay. I guess we should take the last question, and it will come from Richard.
I enjoyed your talk very much, and
thank you.
I was struck by your comment about Sartre, you know, in Paris with the Nazis, and I wonder if you would comment on people who've talked about hierarchies of meaning, specifically what was misunderstood by a lot of people when Joseph Campbell said what we're really looking for in life are experiences of feeling alive. And in my own personal experience, and from what I've read, that the experience of feeling alive is usually involved when you're involved in something bigger than yourself. And it has struck me in the past about Whitehead's comment that occasions of experience are more meaningful when there are feelings involved.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You know, even the terrorists are involved in something bigger than themselves.
Well, that's I did a book a few years back about Trump, called Dark Star Rising: Magic and Power in the Age of Trump. And it started out about how apparently there were Trump supporters, the alt-right, and do they exist anymore? Does anybody ever talk about them anymore? They were like top of the pops a while ago. I never hear anything about them anymore. How the alt-right were using a form of magic on the internet to get Trump into office. Oh, They must have. How else could he have won? Imagine. In any case, but how Trump, appealed to this notion of a bigger meaning. Make America great again. That's just a variation of the golden age. It's some sense of meaning, which sadly the socially conscious left doesn't really get, because they don't work with myth. They don't work with myth. They work with fact. It's all about science, more or less science, and it's more or less material. And again, not in a negative sense, but basically it's based on science, not based on myth, not based on religion. Again, this is in this class I've been doing. Sorry, I had to explain to people that actually the political left starts with the French Revolution, and the fundamental écrasez l'enfant, get rid of the church, get rid of tradition, get rid of the myth, get rid of all that, usher in the new modern scientific age. But even the people in the French Revolution had to install a goddess of reason, because even they recognized that on a fundamental level we need myth of some kind. Is that what that gentleman was talking about? That gives the back stuff. That gives the filler, to the front. That gives the story and that kind of thing. And Trump, he's not a mind in any way whatsoever. He's a Sharpie. He knows what he's doing, and he provided that. And he scarped it out of town as soon as it was over. He took it for a ride as long as he could go. Got a little bit out of it after the collapse. Got a little mileage out of everything falling down around him, and maybe he'll be back. But he's so pre-COVID now, and. But that's what he clicked into that, and I agree with you. It's like its meaning can be, we can get it in different ways. There's like there's mythological junk food, as it were, and that'll satisfy the appetite just in the same way that the real myth will do, but it's more available and easier transmitted these days. So no, I agree with you, but I also want to. Great lines from Whitehead, as he said, religion is what we do with our solitariness. So that this moment when we are alone, and it is just you and the cosmos, and you have these fundamental kind of moments. And that's the sort of people Wilson is talking to. These are the outsiders. It's not necessarily social misfits. Some people that have very well connected in the world and society and all that, but they have a hunger for something that they can't provide. And these are the people that he's talking to. And this is the sort of thing I think Whitehead is trying to get across in these massive books like Process and Reality. I just have to say I never managed to prehend all the way through, but the other ones like Adventure of Ideas and Science in the Modern World, I certainly do. And Modes of Thought, that's one of my favorite books of his. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for your question. Now, unfortunately, we have run a bit over, so I guess we should start closing the session. I'm really sorry for those who wanted to ask a question but weren't able, but I'm sure we'll have opportunities in future sessions. Gary, do you have any final remarks before we close this session?
Well, I mean, just that I could go on. I mean, Wilson had a whole second career, as it were, in the 70s, 80s when he was writing about the occult. And the one thing I didn't, let me see, I'll show you a quick picture. One thing I didn't show very quickly is how, oh, sorry. My mistake. Oh, sorry. Ah, sorry. I just wanted to quickly get to, oh, what happened now? I lost everything. Hold on, I'll get to it.
No problem.
Okay, here we go. Oh, here we go. Come on. Oh, there. Is that coming up? Oh, no, wrong. Oh, sorry. Why is it? Never mind. I was going to show you a picture of how I actually looked when I was first reading him.
Oh.
But I'm seeing if I can get to it. Is it there? Where are we? Somehow. Am I happening here?
No, there's no
share screen. Oh, there.
Oh.
There I am. So there I am in 1975, living in a illegal loft space on the Bowery in New York, when I was playing in the then unknown, but soon to be world famous Blondie. And this is the Wilson book I wrote. See, there you go, a Jungian slip. This is the Wilson book, first Wilson book I read, and in which he makes this remark that the fundamental idea of his is the paradoxical. nature of freedom. So there you go. I've been at it for a long time, folks, and so have you this evening. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gary.
Thank you, Gary. Really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, so thank you for your presentation.
Next time.
Really fantastic. I really, I hope we'll have other opportunities maybe to discuss together. Thank you everyone who participated to the Q&A. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to be on this panel, I guess, so we'll have some opportunity then.
Yes. Well,
all right, well, thank you, everybody. Have a good evening or good morning, wherever you are.
Before we all go, I do have a little announcement to make. Some bad news, some good news. So I don't know if you've received our communication yesterday, but we are sorry to inform you that Dr. Ian McCochrist is indisposed and had to cancel all of his events he had booked this summer. So unfortunately, the event he had scheduled for closing our What is Consciousness event on Sunday, the 27th of June is canceled for his presentation. But the good news is that instead of McCochrist's presentation, we've put together a panel of presenters from the series. At this moment, we have scheduled Beverly Zabriskie, Gary Lachman, Valerie Hardcastle, Roderick Main, and Pavel Pilkanen to be part of this final panel. So we will begin with the panelists responding to questions on topics such as the relationship between matter and consciousness, how quantum mechanics might shed light on the block universe, and how patterns of activations of the human brain during cognitive performance might shed light on consciousness. And then after, we will open it up to the participants, so they'll be able to ask questions to the whole panel. So make sure you have your questions and comments ready for that event. Also, Ian McCochrist has also confirmed that he hasn't canceled, he'll just reschedule his session with the Party Center. And this will be in September, and everyone who had a ticket to attend his event in June will have a free ticket for that event. And of course, it will be open to other participants to get tickets for it. So we will update you later in the summer when this event will happen, but Ian McCochrist will speak to us just later this year. Yes, finally hope to see you all tomorrow for the session with Valerie Hardcastle, who will try to answer the question, what is the neurocorrelative consciousness? And yes, I'll see you tomorrow. Thank you all again for joining us, and we'll see you again soon here at the Party Center.